until we can get things back up and running. And there was one organization where they couldn't even get in the building. The systems were completely locked out. Finally got in the building, and you think it's just power outage or whatever, but they couldn't even get into the data center. They had to cut a hole in the wall to get into the actual physical data center.
Welcome everyone. I'm here today with Thomas Bryant, Director of Product Marketing at Commvault. And we have some really good topics to talk about today when it comes to cyber recovery and disaster recovery. And like I can tell you, we have some interesting topics to go through and some pretty good stories as well. So Thomas, first of all, great name, and it's absolutely exciting to have you here today. So tell us a little bit more about you and what you're doing right now, and probably also a little bit what you have done in the past.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, first and foremost. But yes, so my name's Thomas Bryant. I wear many hats at Commvault. So I've been here for almost 2 years now, and I have responsibilities over some of our product marketing, technical marketing, partner marketing, and some of my background as well. One of the other things I do here at Commvault is competitive intelligence. And so I've been doing that for a long time. Before I was at Commvault, I was at a small company. Folks may have heard of VMware. And before that, some other places, but I was a sysadmin for a long time, running networks, building data centers, doing Active Directory, upgrades and things like that from way back in the day. So I've seen a lot. I've had to carry the phone or the pager around with me for many hours. But yeah, I've worn a lot of hats throughout my career. And I think the biggest thing that I love about product marketing is having worn hats of being in the data center and knowing the pains that come along with it. It helps me now do an even better job because it makes me more relatable, I guess, to some of those things, because we, as sysadmins and those folks that are watching that have done this, they know how painful it can be sometimes when things go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the great thing, right? Like all the time, I'm like thinking I talk to someone from marketing, I think like, okay, they're gonna just point out some points there about their products and whatnot, but you really went through the pain of being a sysadmin and doing all that work in that space. So that's definitely exciting to and someone who can actually relate. So yeah, and obviously, like topic-wise, we're going to talk about disaster recovery and cyber recovery, and I think you are an absolutely great person to talk to this. We talked before, and so I know that there is a lot of interesting stuff. But maybe you can give us a little bit of the history of disaster recovery and cyber recovery, and like how this changed over the last years or decades, even or maybe months, right? Because I think it's getting more and more important, obviously, and the reasons why you might need cyber recovery or disaster recovery also might change a little bit, right? In the past, it was maybe more designed for system failures and things like that, and in today's world, it might be a little bit other reasons as well. So maybe you can give us a little bit.
You hit it perfectly there in terms of, when I think of disaster recovery, and I imagine many are similar, disaster recovery is, okay, I've got a site A, and it's we have a power outage, there's an asteroid that crashes into it, whatever it may be, and I need to bring that site back up somewhere else at site B. And so, when I started going through IT many moons ago, disaster recovery for us was that, right? If we have a system go down or an entire data center go down, can we bring that site up somewhere else? But it makes the assumption that we have all of the data and we know the data is good. And I think that's the big difference when we start talking about cyber recovery, is that in disaster recovery, we're just planning for the unforeseen, right? The hurricane comes through. We've been replicating our data somewhere else. We know that the data is good. It might be a little out of date. It's not maybe live data, right? Some things may be a day old or a week old, and some things we may have to recover manually or just after the fact. But we know that the data is good. There's not a lot of checking we need to do other than we have a run book. It says bring these things up in order of 1, 2, 3, 4, and off we go. Where I think cyber recovery comes in is it's that kind of natural extension of disaster recovery. right? It's not necessarily something completely different, but if you take disaster recovery and you now throw in the kind of monkey wrench, if you will, of, is the data good anymore? Can I trust the data because I've had some sort of threat actor in there? Maybe it's malware, or they were exfiltrating data. We don't know what they were doing, so we don't know what data is good and what data is bad. So now we have to treat everything as suspect, right? We don't know if it's going to continue to work. If I bring it online at, let's say, another site, will I now give them keys to that site as well? And I think that's where people have to extend what they're doing naturally with disaster recovery and kind of branch off. I don't know if you'd call it like a fork, right? But almost a forking of your disaster recovery plan to say, what happens in the case of a cyber incident? What steps do I need to think about in terms of how can I go through testing and planning and building up a run book so that I have a process and a procedure for when those incidents happen? Because, I'm going to say it sounds kind of silly because I'm a marketing person, but everybody in the industry is saying time and time again now, it is not a matter of if you get hit, it is when you get hit. And I think you could even extend that as farther to be, will you find out that you're hit on the news first, or when the bad actors actually reach out to you? Because it's amazing how much they're coming out and coming after people. And we've even seen in the news where the threat actors will actually go to folks like the SEC and say, hey, these guys had a breach because we breached you and they didn't report it to you. So we've got all kinds of interesting problems that this cyber recovery is extending from DR.
Yeah, I think it's crazy times where we are in, right? And I think like thinking differently about recovery is definitely something we need to totally think it through, right? I mean, I know a lot of like companies who now started, like, well, not now, but like years ago already started to have their Bitcoin wallets ready in case they get ransomware, because they know that this is not going to happen, and we want to, like, if we are not able to recover from this in a clean and good way, at least we can, like, say, pull the trigger and say, okay, we're going to pay the ransom. And things like that. And that's where we are. And to me, this is not a surprise, right? Like, if I look at like a lot of like companies from the past, or like from experience, I mean, like IT is currently like very understaffed in many cases, not everywhere, but like many cases understaffed as well, right? And then and maybe underfunded. But even if you have enough funds to, like, it's probably hard to find these like IT security experts, right? Like they don't grow on trees, right? And so I think it's a pretty interesting thing there. So yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, well, I think to your point, I mean, it's kind of it's early days, but it's not. I mean, the threats have been around for quite a while. We even some of the companies I've worked with in the past have been hit. And going through that exercise, and this is 20, 30 years ago. But I think what you're seeing now, especially, is a lot of the folks that do get hit by these attacks, it's so stressful and they don't want to necessarily go through it again, but now they've got expertise. They're going off and now creating consulting companies. They're creating a whole new industry, right, of opportunity for them to now go to companies that don't have the expertise. And that's something that we see a lot, especially in industry surveys. We've done a few ourselves where we find, customers that have been hit before, those companies that have been attacked, their recovery times are significantly better now because they know what they at least know what they don't know, and they know the areas to spend time and money and effort to enhance their security profile, as opposed to those who don't, and they're just kind of, maybe they're smaller and they just think, who's going to hit us? We're a small shop. We've got, 50 servers. We've got a little bit in the cloud. They think they're safe. Well, those are ones that are actually the most vulnerable.
Yeah. I tell everyone, like, you're not too small to get hit, right? This is not about the size or anything. Like, this is, and as you said, they're probably even like easier targets than some of the large ones. So By the way, one thing I found very interesting when we talked about this cyber recovery, and I was thinking when I asked the question about this, like kind of like how we thought about this in the past, right? So in the past, we were probably thinking about recovering from a disaster and things like that, and then we started to think about, okay, this can also be like in case of an attack, and then I think one of the first things we started to think of is like, okay, we need to protect our backups, right? Like if they're not protected, if they're already in there, then that's also a problem. But then you brought something interesting up. Is like, is the data clean in that one, right? So this is kind of like, for me, this is even the next step is like, okay, do I immediately recover the data somewhere and help them even to spread even further, right? And I think that is something, I think, a very interesting thing to talk about as well. Is like, okay, and to think about this. So
yeah. I mean, it's so true because I mean, and nowadays you don't even know if you can trust the hardware that underlies your environment, because we've heard of state-sponsored attacks. We've seen large malware groups that are infecting firmware. I mean, I ran into an organization a while back. They did a recovery. They actually had a clean room, and when they brought things back up and turned off all the old servers, they disconnected it. They got hit almost immediately again because the attacker was actually in a printer. They hit their backdoor in was through a printer firmware. It was fascinating. But then they had to go through it all again, and it was just, wow, the level of detail of what you need to think about. But yeah, it's not just the how we bring it back, but it's where we bring it back and what can we trust. And you know, it's passé to say the whole zero trust thing, but it really is true. You have to think about it as though we can't trust anything, and what do we need to do to be able to get back up and running. And I think to some extent, some of the legacy kind of terms are applicable, things like RPO, RTO. But I also think that there's this opportunity where organizations need to rethink, like, what really matters to you when you need to get back online.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, that's an interesting question. Like, I mean, or story is with this printer. I mean, I hate printers in general. Like, I think I'm allergic to it. Or like, I mean, probably everyone is. I think it's a printer thing. So yeah, I heard some crazy stories about printer. I never heard it in terms of security stuff, but in terms of like, okay, we can actually get a lot of data out of these printers as well. And so, but in terms of security firmware stuff, that's obviously an interesting one as well. So you also had, I mean, with your like work before as well as now, you had some other crazy stories there. Like, what is your kind of like one of your favorite cyber recovery or cybersecurity stories you have seen in your past?
I don't know that any of them are favorites per se. They're all painful. I will say the one thing you remember the most is the smell of them. And I say that, and I'll get into the story, but I think the most interesting part is the long hours, right? Whenever a major cyber incident happens at a company, regardless of size, it's all hands on deck. Everybody comes in, everybody's working until we can get things back up and running. And there was one organization where they couldn't even get in the building. The systems were completely locked out. Finally got in the building, and you think it's just power outage or whatever, but they couldn't even get in the data center. They had to cut a hole in the wall to get into the actual physical data center. The HVAC was off. It was hot. It was insane because they had basically turned off most of the power of the building. Fortunately, the systems they had were running on a generator and UPSs, but like even they had warehouses that had like freezers in them, and those were off. So they had to worry about, the merchandise that they had in the freezers and the coolers. But yeah, I mean, the scary part of all of that was you don't know. Like when I got there on site with them and we were going through, we had no idea what was going on. And so as we started to find traces of, okay, this isn't normal. No, it's not a hardware failure. No, the systems were shut down and we could get into some limited areas, but everything was basically locked down. The one thing that was still working for them was their mainframe. And I think the benefit of having legacy tech was that whoever was attacking them didn't know how to use the mainframe, and they couldn't get into the mainframe. So at least part of their production systems and their business systems were still running, fortunately.
Wow.
But email, communications, file shares, all that stuff, they had virtualization and desktop, virtual desktops, all kinds of stuff. Everything else was pretty much down. So it's like the main part of the system was up, but everything else was down. And there were long hours. I mean, a lot of us were sleeping in the conference room. We ordered in a lot of pizza. We ordered in, a lot of popcorn, a lot of coffee, a lot of Monster and Red Bulls. But it was fascinating because they had a great DR plan. This is a company that was in manufacturing, and they had a great DR plan. But what they found, and what we all found, was just, okay, so again, what data is clean? Where do we recover this? There was no clean room or place that we could recover. It was recovering to the same hardware, but essentially we had to build another network to bring stuff back up. And we were lucky back then that we had no idea that stuff could be in the firmware, but we were able to bring things back up one at a time and bring it back from tapes. Funny enough, the biggest problem we had was not recovering the data. It was getting the data back because all the tapes had been shipped off site. And so we actually had to wait for the tapes to come back on site so that we could bring them back in. And that tells you a little bit about how old this story is, right? I mean, nowadays people are backing up nearline to, storage. They're backing it up to cloud storage. And maybe tape for archival purposes, but tape back then was the primary storage that we were using for this. So it brought a lot of problems to the forefront, and it also made us realize that there was a big disconnect even back then between what our security team was doing with perimeter defense and the fact that if the attackers get in, there really wasn't a lot to prevent them from going north and south and east and west. We just had built these big walls and made really deep moats, but once they were in, it was, oh my goodness. And it caused that company to actually undergo massive changes to their security profile of how do they protect their systems. And they were very early in the adoption of microsegmentation and things like that, because they realized, kind of like, as I mentioned earlier, that once you've been through it once, you realize how painful it is, and you never, ever want to have it happen again.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds like a crazy story, especially like when you mentioned like you don't even have access to the building anymore. I mean, that like is the scary part, right? I mean, I heard these stories. I haven't really like gone through it. Like I don't know if it's a specific one, but like hotels where elevators stopped working and things like that. So these kind of things, like sometimes we like think about, okay, I don't receive any emails, I can't go into my programs. But then there's much more behind this these days, and not just maybe these days, like also in the past, right? As you mentioned, like again, when I think about these like large refrigerators and things like that, like how much you can actually destroy by like turning them off or changing temperature or whatever. And also, I mean, again, like locking down the places, like sounds like a life-threatening thing as well. I mean, I don't know like how the situation was. I don't want to make it more critical than it was, but sounds like this is not something I want to be part of from the inside when everything locks, right? So
no, absolutely not. Yeah, it was scary. I mean, and now even now everything's connected to the internet, right? Internet of Things. We've got sensors everywhere. Everything's connected, and you can manage it all, which also makes it a potential target for threat actors to get in and use that. And if they can find, some random IP camera that has a security vulnerability, and they can get into yours through some, cloud-based service, that might be their in. So it's a daunting problem for folks to try to secure their environment, but also it's a different mindset now to just make the assumption of, look, we can't trust anything, we're going to get hit. We need to plan for that. And planning is one part of it, but then getting into like the testing and the rigor of it is another part that they have to find time to do.
So when we speak about the planning stuff, like obviously when we looked at it in the past, we were also talking about different metrics we want to measure this, and like what are our objectives there. And we did this with RPO and RTO. Are these still the right metrics in this time today, or is there something different you would like? What does it take?
Yeah. So recovery point objective and recovery time objective, RPO, RTO, I think are still important. But I don't know that the industry standardized on any new terms. I mean, one of the ones that I tend to use is MTTR, but not in the mean time to recovery. I actually look at it more as mean time to revenue. And what I mean by that, right, is what systems do you need to bring back online so that you can operate and generate cash flow? Because it's different for every company, right? If I'm a retail company, it's probably my registers, it's making sure that my buildings are able to talk, and that I can, process orders, things like that, the website. If I'm a pharmaceutical company or manufacturing, maybe it's, making sure my production equipment is online and I can generate those and I can ship out things right from my warehouse. But what are those systems that are required to get my revenue engine going again? Because it's okay that, I can't print or things are a little bit slow, but if I can't process orders and I can't generate revenue, then I have a real problem. Right now, I can't make money. How am I going to pay a ransom if I can't even get money in to pay them? Do I have money just sitting aside? So I think that idea around recovering and thinking about what are the bare minimum requirements to get your business up and running again. I don't know what that term's going to wind up being. I doubt it'll be mean time to revenue. But I don't know what that one is, but I think the RPO and RTO still stand, but it also presents a different problem that I think people don't think about. And that problem is actually recovery. If you have to recover full sets of data, you need to think about how you architect your systems differently. And what I mean by that is when I go through a life cycle of building a new application and moving it into production, I'll pick on-prem for a minute, right? I build it and do dev test. I run it through maybe UAT or QA, whatever you want to call it, user acceptance testing. And then eventually it makes it to production. And then I start filling it in with data. And now this thing is alive and it lives for however long. But when I built that system and I built it for production, I built it for daily use. And that means that I expect it to get some amount of data in every day. And I'm going to back that up. And it's pretty well understood. But a database, that database could grow to, hundreds of gigabytes, grow to petabytes. If you now have to recover all of it because you can't assume that the data is safe anymore, and then it's good, and I'm doing a full recovery, petabytes of data, recovering that on a system that maybe only has a 1 gig E or a 10 gig E, it's going to take a long time. And people don't think about the fact that a full recovery of all of their systems, like DR is different. Because again, DR, you're replicating the data. You assume the data is good. I can just flip a switch and go. But with cyber recovery, if I can't trust the data, I need to rethink how I recover because I may not have the scalability to recover quick enough to bring my revenue engine back online. So it actually creates all kinds of new opportunities, but also problems when we start thinking about, well, I need to bring this database back online. And I've got if I've got a recovery time objective of an hour and the database is a petabyte or, multiple petabytes, you're not breaking the laws of physics, last I checked, or anybody is. So how am I going to bring that data back fast enough? You need to think about how you architect for cyber recovery very differently than you do for a disaster recovery incident. So it brings all kinds of new challenges and opportunities for companies.
Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. Like, there's a very interesting thought about this, and I mean, I saw these kind of like things like in the past, like years ago, where the disaster recovery thing was not really the thought was not really there, right? So they were thinking, we back this up, and if a VM dies, right, like, okay, we're gonna recover that VM, that single VM, that's fine. And then they had situations, and again, I'm going back. This is obviously not in today's world; it's even bigger, right? But back then, it was even like, okay, so now there's a whole storage away. How do I recover now this whole storage volume, for example? And this is like terabytes and terabytes of data. And I did not design it the right way. So my backups are somewhere in another server room, connected very poorly. And now I need to like transfer these, like, and it's a smaller example. And again, in this case, you don't even have a bad actor, but kind of like is a problem, right? And so we started to design around this for DR. And now it's same thing, I think, relatable with cyber recovery as well, where you, like as you mentioned, need to think about the recovery. And I like the way you think about this in terms of revenue, because like many times I had conversation with people when it was about recovery and backup, they were always saying, yeah, everything needs to be restored. Like okay, so like, yeah, okay, but like it's kind of like, as you said, it's like physics, right? I cannot make like this and everything is back. So we need to like maybe prioritize things and architect and like make it the right decisions. And I think keeping the core business, as you mentioned, like that needs to be running, right? So I want to make sure that customers can get their orders in and I can sell stuff or deliver stuff or create stuff, whatever your core business is. So that's definitely interesting thinking of. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, to say, I mean, and there's certain parts that are shared services too, right? Like some of the core ones, like around authentication. Great example, right? Active Directory. I mean, there are so many systems, like building systems, things that tie into whatever LDAP system you may use for authentication nowadays. So it's not just even, hey, we bring up a server. It's we need to make sure we remember all the core things, DNS, DHCP. Although those things that we take for granted and we just assume are just going to kind of work, maybe we're using them in our network equipment or whatever, but you have to plan for all of it. You can't just think, oh, hey, it's like, to your point, right? It's not just a VM. It can be everything. You really have to think about all aspects of your entire corporate network and your extended networks, right? Even out to people, because it may be one thing for you to bring up your systems, but if salespeople can't get into your network because your VPN services or whatever you're using for users to authenticate is no longer working, it can be challenging.
There's some interesting things there. So first of all, like I was thinking about this when you brought up the building situation where you can't get out into the building and things like that, and then now you brought up identity. So I remember the crazy situation when I was a consultant years back. It was like the situation where I had to do some Active Directory work. So I suddenly got domain admin rights to work on this. But I did not have enough rights like to go physically to the restroom. Like I was not able to go. So someone had like, I don't know, it was like kind of like a strange situation, right? I could take down the whole company, but I cannot go to the restroom. So it's like, that's a fun part. But yeah, you're absolutely right there with these different things to think about. And then you had like, what was the last thing you said at the end? Like you were just talking about something which I found very interesting.
Oh my goodness.
I had a good example for it.
Yeah, it was just like DNS and DHCP and just all the things you have to think about, that aren't necessary. They're not necessarily like a Windows system, right? And it could be another group. Was that the piece? Maybe.
Yeah. So I mean, they are now connect. Like what I was thinking was like, okay, well now it's not just like IT services. There's like with like you mentioned this earlier, right? Like they're connected with IoT devices and things like that, and so it has much more impact these days as we need to think about these things as well, right? And it's not just about sending an email or something like that anymore. So yeah. So when we talk about these different objectives, like one thing we really want to talk about, and this is like really the new kind of like part I like to talk about, is like testing, right? So what you're basically saying is, okay, now you have like you probably are under attack, and you have a backup or like something, right? Like some sort of data. How do I now make sure that this is not already bad? How can I look at this? And so, so what is your take on this? Like, what do people need to think about when they come to the testing part? Because when we talked to testing in the part, it was just like testing was like, can I restore? That was the test, right? Can I restore? Like that is what probably most people think when we talk about testing in terms of DR and things like that. Is it actually working? But there's more to it, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about testing an individual system, it's very different, because if I just bring up an individual machine, like a virtual machine, I'm already making kind of assumptions. Active Directory or your LDAP is online, all the other pieces are in place, all my firewalls and routing are already in place, and things just, I'm bringing up one thing. It's almost that pets versus cattle kind of discussion, like from the containers world versus VMs. But in cyber recovery, it's very different, because again, if you're assuming that everything is suspect, and we don't know what to trust. Now we have to go through different steps because we could have the data there, but again, how do we ensure the quality of that data? So there's different things that organizations should hopefully be doing. And so some of those things are, of course, at the beginning, before you ever get attacked. You should always be trying to quantify your risk. So you should be looking at what you have, looking at things in your network. Where do I have risk? Do I have files that are unsecured? Is there data that's unencrypted? Are there files, for example, that have open permissions that anyone could get into? Because if a bad actor gets in and your payroll data is all right there in a spreadsheet, that's probably a bad idea. Or you've got, you see things with, some of the online services where people are using for source code repositories, right? They're leaving their secrets in just text files. That's a bad thing. So I think there's ways that organizations need to start even before an attack to minimize their risk. And that involves looking at their live data, but you can also look at your backup data. I mean, and one of the things that we do here at Commvault around cyber resilience is looking at all that data. Because backup data is a great way for you to be able to see revisions of data, right? So as you're protecting that data over time, you can look at it and look for things that are changes. Hey, all of a sudden files start becoming encrypted, maybe a little bit here, a little bit there, like with a BitLocker or whatever. What are those changes that we can start to look for and isolate that are precursors of attacks? But then even once you get into an attack, all right, so now I need to do a recovery. How do I do it cleanly? Most companies can't afford a clean room, like a physical clean room. They're expensive. Not every company can afford a physical cyber vault. That's what a lot of people will call them that. So what are their opportunities? And I think this is a great way that we can leverage the power of cloud now to help customers recover their data, but also test. And I think when you think about testing, the key is make the assumption you have nothing, right? So you have to build up your authentication services, your network services, your connectivity, your firewalls, all that stuff you need to think about when you're doing a recovery, because you have to assume it's all bad. And if you plan for the worst, you can, you hope for the best, plan for the worst. Then when you get into it that things are going to fail, you're going to iterate on it. Oh, hey, this didn't work. I'm going to bring it back up. And once you have the basic stuff, right? I know I can bring servers online and I can authenticate. They can talk out to the internet. They can talk to my mainframe. Customers can get into them, whatever. Now I can start to bring back applications. But I think the big piece is that we need to focus on to begin with is that idea of testing. Because testing brings along with it the rigor of you need to plan, you need to think about what's actually important, right? Again, back to that mean time to revenue thing. If you focus on what's most important to the business, maybe that's revenue, maybe it's something else, maybe it's patient care, right? It could be different if you're a hospital, because I want to make sure that people can have patient care and they can go through and get surgeries, whatever. Focus on that thing that matters the most. And then figure out as you build in a clean room, and the cloud's great for this, in that you don't have to spend millions of dollars on hardware. You can build things, you can test them. It's isolated by its very nature, being in a cloud. You don't have to connect it to anything in the outside world. You can test and find what works. You can see what breaks, and then just quickly iterate on it and not have to spend a fortune to actually do testing. And I think testing is the most important part right now, because until you test, you don't know what's going to fail and what's going to work. And that is the worst place to be in the case of a cyber attack, is to not know what to do, because that's when you get into like these various like cognitive biases that you get into of like, well, let's just do whatever we need to. Like, that's not the thing to do. You really want to have a plan.
Yeah. I like, there's two things I liked very much. I don't want to forget the first one. It was very interesting as well. Like this, I never thought about this, but obviously having these backup history things and thinking about this, like how did they develop to actually see if something is going on, is actually very interesting. I think, like, I don't know what the number is, like what the average number of is. Someone is in your network, like hackers are in your network until they get detected even, I think, but it's a couple of 100 days. I'm not sure if you know the number in your head. But
depends on who you're talking to, but 204 days is one of the ones that we hear, which just for reference for folks, It 204 days, that's longer than my kids go to school every year. So it's an entire school year and then a little bit. That's how long they typically will dwell in a network.
It's crazy how long like this is, right? And like how and again, in many cases probably even longer, right? Like I mean, we don't know, right? So in some cases they're probably even longer. And the other part is now, so with this like as you said, leveraging the cloud as kind of like this clean room. And this is very interesting to me because obviously, like as you said, the cloud is really a perfect place to design like this, right? Mm-hmm. Because you get it on demand whenever you need it. You only pay for it when you use it, and all that good stuff the cloud brings with it. But the challenge with this is, right, like cloud is not done, to me, is not like working with customers, not done like, oh yeah, I never done cloud, now do cloud in 2 seconds, right? Or to the next hour, right? And probably during the pack and restore, you probably don't want to learn all these things and prepare all these things at that point, right? You should be ready for this. Yeah. This should be something which you can, okay, now we know what to do. I mean, and that's also what we said during disaster recovery scenarios back in the days is like, hey, be ready because will have enough stress with other things, right? So how can they get ready? Like, how does, like, especially because you said, like with Commvault, we get this kind of like a solution which can help us with this. So maybe you can tell us a little bit what it does, and also maybe what customers maybe still need to prepare for to have that.
Sure. So one of the things that we introduced with Commvault Cloud last year was a thing called Cleanroom Recovery. And it's designed exactly around this, which is it's designed to give you a guaranteed clean room or area you can recover data to. So we leverage Microsoft Azure. And what we do is we essentially can help customers build a brand new tenant. So we know that it's clean, it's isolated, it's not connected to anything. And we can recover their data into that clean, isolated tenant so that you can do things like testing. Or you even mentioned, right, if you want to go back in time and look at and see when did they get in or what did they do, you could do things like forensics because you can recover it into a clean area, let the malware come if you want to. But we also, along with that clean room, we have scanning technologies that can scan the live data, that can look at the backup data and look for those sorts of changes so that we do understand when you need to recover. One of the big challenges is like, okay, when I need to recover, what's my last known good data? Because is it from today? Is it from last week? Is it from last year? Again, if you're having to recover, well, I don't know, we'll try today's data. No, it doesn't work. We'll try yesterday's data. That can take forever, right? Again, we get into the laws of physics. I feel like I'm on a NASA episode or something, or but like you've got to figure out when is the data that you have, when was it good, and how can I recover just clean data? I still want to scan it because I don't want to assume anything, but we can help customers understand what data is good and when the last known good copies are. So we just bring back the good data when we're recovering. And then again, you can iterate on that very quickly because with us, we've created essentially automated workflows, and you can tailor that however you need to for your business to be able to recover those workflows in a very programmatic, very systematic way. You set priority, you say what comes up first, what comes up second, you define, any customization that needs to happen, because that's the thing is you need to be able to iterate. You're going to find something works, something doesn't work. Okay, we fix it, we try it again. And again, like to your point, right? That's the cost effectiveness of the cloud. One of the other unique things that we bring with Commvault is because we store data a little bit differently than most. It allows us this kind of any-to-any portability. And what I mean by that is when I protect workloads that are on-prem, let's say they're in a certain hypervisor that a lot of folks use. Because we back up that data, we actually strip away the layers that make it that specific virtualization platform so that when we recover it, we can put it right back. But if let's say we want to restore it as an Azure VM instead, we can do that when we're actually doing the recovery. We don't have to do any sort of like V to V or P to V kind of like transition. And we find that helps a lot in these use cases because why not leverage? If I'm going to move it to the cloud, I might as well use things, right? Do I need to use SQL Server on-prem? No, I should use Azure SQL. It's there. Why not leverage that? It actually means I can get recovers faster because now I'm just recovering a database instead of the database and the application that runs the database. So there's lots of really interesting things that customers are going to find. But for us at Commvault, it really starts with our foundational data protection. You've got to have something like that, but then extending on that with this concept of a clean room and being able to look and plan for your risk all the way through to knowing, all right, when I do a recovery, what that orchestrated and automated recovery can be. We think that that's a huge value for customers. And that's where we've seen a lot of traction with folks, is just they're starting to understand that concept. They're seeing the news every day, and they're realizing that you do need to start testing, and now's the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this sounds super interesting. And that was actually one of my just a question when you talked about, well, one in my head was just immediately like, okay, so I'm taking that on-prem data in maybe it's even like from somewhere else, right? And then I'm like use Cleanroom in Azure and do all this. Where do I then restore? And it sounds like you can like restore again to an on-prem thing, but you could also restore to the cloud. And what I can see is like, this is also obviously, I mean, you said you need to have kind of like a clean infra again, right? So that you cannot, like the existing one might be infected, like there's firmware issues, right? And all that. So you need to find a place, and like probably hard to quickly set up a place like this. So the cloud in this case could be a potential good target. And I can see that many companies would at one point say, okay, just move it to the cloud. We need to get things operational again, and use that. So but I also like that it's kind of like also a super quick migration tool. So as well.
It is. One last point I'll make is just the way we store data is a little different too. And it's one of the reasons that the cloud works really well for us is the way that we architected our platform years and years ago. We decentralized the management and the data planes, so we separated them. And I know it's kind of nerdy, but what does it actually mean? Really what it means is that when we store our data, we don't have to have compute tied to it. Why that benefits you in the cloud, right? What's the most expensive thing in the cloud? It's the compute, right? It's once you turn on a resource, but just storing things as storage is relatively inexpensive. And so what we see is a lot of customers wanting to leverage cloud, but they're afraid of the cost, because we just store their data up in the Azure, right? So if we're storing their data for their clean room up in Azure already, it's ready to go. We don't have any compute necessarily tied to it. So it's very low cost. It's very cost effective. And I think that's the biggest barrier of entry, beyond customers not knowing, like, what should I do or where should I start? It's, well, they look at the cost of it and they're like, well, it's going to cost me this much in the cloud, or it's going to cost me this much on-prem, and they just balk at it. But this is actually one way that you can actually do this, and it doesn't break the bank. Our CEO, and I know I'm going markety for a second, but like, he made a great comment the other day on the news of just like democratizing this idea of clean recoveries, because it's always been out of reach. It's always been very expensive. And that's why the biggest organizations can do it, but the smaller folks can't, because it's just so expensive. And so the way that we store our data, we found that made a perfect use case, because it doesn't have to break the bank. Anybody can afford to do this.
Yeah. It sounds, it's really like, it's kind of like takes really advantage of these like cloud things and makes it accessible to basically everyone, like to every organization, to say, okay, I can now take advantage of this cloud, of the dynamic of the cloud, and all that, of these principles of like paying on demand and whatever. This kind of like thing, and then also making it easy in terms of having these automation steps as well in place. And I think like this is also very like interesting, to having like this control plane and data plane separated. If I understood you correctly, you said, like, for example, also like databases, restoring databases. So if I have a local like SQL server, had like this traditional server running the VM, whatever, I think you said like, now I can restore this to an Azure SQL instance, actually, like not having the same server, but like actually using past services. Okay.
Yeah, if that's the way that the customers want to go, absolutely. I mean, why not? Maybe they want the warm and fuzzy of restoring the full thing, but it almost gets into that. There's a slightly different conversation you can have in that, because it's kind of that difference between rebuilding an application and just recovering or repaving kind of part of it. Because if you have to recover the full application, that's more time, right? That's all. And the other thing too is, it's not just recovering the application, it's all the settings that go along with that, right? It's all the metadata, it's the in the cloud, it's like VPCs and VXNets and all the other configuration data that people don't necessarily think about. So if you can leverage PaaS services and just recover your database to a PaaS, why not? It just makes recovery potentially even speedier.
Yeah. No, this sounds like a fantastic solution. I think, like, especially when it comes to the clean room recovery, I love that concept, right? I think it's something really essential for most of the companies to look at this these days. Again, for all the reasons we talked earlier about. So yeah, thank you very much for that update. That was very insightful. I enjoyed that very much. So your last words, do you have anything else to share? Or if not, if people are now interested in learning more about Commvault and especially clean room recovery, where do they go?
Yeah. So if you're interested, obviously you can come to commvault.com and learn all about what we do. The biggest thing I would say is we recently published a ransomware readiness survey. And we went out and talked to over 1,000 CISOs, IT professionals, to ask them about how are they recovering from a cyber recovery event. What are things that are interesting? And there's a lot of really interesting data points in there that I would encourage anyone to read, whether they leverage Commvault or not. It's a great report to learn about what are some of the maturity steps that you can take for your organization to prepare for a cyber event. So I'd really encourage folks to go out and read that. If you want to reach out to me, I'm big on LinkedIn. You can find me Thomas Bryant at Commvault. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to talk with anybody. I'm always available and free to chat.
Awesome. Thank you very much. We will definitely have all the links in the description below this video, so you can actually go and check all this out. And again, thank you very much, Thomas, for being on the show today. Really enjoyed it. Had a great conversation. I would love to spend more time talking about these things. But yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone watching. Make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next one.